maybe Philip Kitcher turned an outline of Lewis's into a paper, maybe. But there's this paper on divine evil, and I took it to be just this argument from hell, saying that if God were to
You could interpret that in two ways. An argument from hell. Oh, that's the argument from hell. The worst I've ever encountered.
It's from hell. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I really love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. On this podcast, I have experts on to share their wisdom in those different fields, philosophy, theology, nature, and life. And today is no different. I have with me Dr. Dean Zimmerman. He is a professor of philosophy in the Rutgers University Philosophy Department, and he's the co-director of the Rutgers Center of Philosophy of Religion with Brian Leftow. I'm really excited for this one because we're going to be talking about David Lewis and Dr. Zimmerman's relationship with him and to him. We're also going to be talking about David Lewis's conception of God and divine evil. And then we'll be thinking about a theistic conception of modal realism following David Lewis as well. Lewis's possible worlds, and maybe we'll get into some Plantinga stuff as well. It's going to be really fun. I'm really excited for it. Before we hop in, though, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for making this podcast happen. You guys are awesome. I seriously appreciate it. This is something that I want to do full time. I would love to be able to fly out to Rutgers today and talk with Dean in person. So if you guys like this podcast, if it's your top 5, top 10, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can join for as little as $3 a month. And starting at $5 a month, you get early access to episodes. So you get to see them and hear them before everyone else. And we're just coming out with a bunch of new stuff. You can join the Facebook group. That's for free. If you're a listener, Parker's Pensées Penseurs. And there's a lot of great discussions happening there. I think we're going to be starting a Discord server. You can find us you can find me on Twitter. You can find another community on Reddit. We're all over the place. We're tracking down the socials. So if you like this podcast, you can support financially. You can join all these groups, and you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. All right. So without further ado, let's jump in and let's talk all things David Lewis and Dean Zimmerman. I'm really excited for it. Dr. Zimmerman, Dean, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, this is awesome. You're a very busy man, and I really appreciate you making some time here to talk about this. Before we jump into Lewis stuff, I was curious, how did you get into philosophy in the first place?
I suppose it was in high school, reading. Well, it's an old story, at least for people of my generation.
Okay.
You were raised in some kind of evangelical, or in my case, Pentecostal kind of background. At some point, you discovered C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer.
That's right.
And I was sitting around a table at Wheaton at some conference back in the early 90s. Maybe it was probably 91 or 2. And we were, well, maybe it was a little later than that, because I feel like Andrew Chignell was there, and maybe Tim O'Connor, and it was people from, I guess Andrew's a little younger than me, but a table full of people about my age, all of whom are now philosophy professors, or were then, in fact. And you just went around, what sort of opened your mind to studying philosophy? Francis Schaeffer. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And also kind of odd and a little ironic, because he, in some ways, Schaeffer wasn't a great philosopher.
That's what I hear. Yeah, right. You look at it, he's got no footnotes ever. Yeah.
No, and he tended to give you, very he gave you potted versions of different positions, and but that said, he was obviously an important figure because he was somehow respectable to read.
Yeah.
It was okay. And somehow C.S. Lewis too. He got to be okay.
Yeah.
And yet he interacted with currents in philosophy going way back, but also up to what he was thinking of as the present day, like existentialism,
Right.
And he sort of gave us license to think about these things and read these authors ourselves. So I think he played a huge role in kind of opening up the kind of evangelical mind, to the extent that it did open up.
Yeah.
There's Mark Knowles' famous book about the scandal of the American mind, and did he write a follow-up, like The Closing of the American Mind? Or Evangelical Mind, or something like that? But so maybe he didn't change evangelicalism and make it suddenly intellectual.
Yeah.
But people who grew up in the kind of environment that I grew up in, he was important because he introduced us to some figures.
Yeah.
And also Malcolm Muggeridge. I read Malcolm Muggeridge as a kid somehow. And Walker Percy's little book, Lost in the Cosmos. I read that right when it came out. And that's just a weird little book with quite a bit of philosophy in it.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Is Muggeridge A Rumor of Angels? Is that him?
That doesn't sound right.
Okay.
He was a journalist,
right,
and a television journalist in Britain. He was a spy of some kind in World War II in Africa.
Wow. Okay.
And he wrote a really good memoir. What's it called? Shoot, I can't think of it. It's a two-volume memoir, and then he wrote kind of the same books over and over and over again for for a number of years. But he wrote a cute little book that just focused on like people who were really important to him spiritually. And if I remember right, it was Simone Weil, Tolstoy, I think Pascal was in there. Anyway, a number of them were philosophers, and they were just a single chapter, and enough to inspire me to try to read these people myself.
Awesome. Well, when you were, I guess, what was your relationship to Wheaton College? Were you just there for like a conference, or did you? Okay. Did you ever bump into like Arthur Holmes at all?
Yeah, I did. Wonderful guy.
Yeah.
And I think he played the same kind of Francis Schaeffer-y role for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But he was a much better philosopher. I mean, Francis Schaeffer was a theologian. He was a theologian and an apologist and a big thinker. But Art Holmes was a real philosopher and wrote some excellent books. I read one of his books when I was in high school, I think, or maybe it was the beginning of college. All Truth is God's Truth.
Yeah, of course. I love that book.
Yeah, that was kind of eye-opening.
Yeah.
He was a part of a summer school that I went to there for younger professors or advanced graduate students that Al Plantinga led in 1989, maybe.
Okay.
Something like that.
That sounds awesome.
And it was 88, maybe, actually. It was terrific. Yeah. And Art Holmes was great. And that circle of people, some of them have remained my friends to this day,
Man,
including
yeah.
Tom Senor. Tom Senor was
Oh,
there.
okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So I started getting into philosophy my senior year of college, and one of my friends was studying philosophy at Northern Illinois. I went there to wrestle only, but ended up learning some philosophy. My friend put me on to this series by Art Holmes that's on YouTube. It's like 89 of his lectures. So
Wow.
it's like 89 hours worth of philosophy lectures. So I would like skip class and just be watching Art Holmes. So in a major way, he was like the intro to philosophy for me. I really liked that guy.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a good place to start. And he had such a good grasp of the history of philosophy,
Yeah.
and not just one era. I mean, that's something that people like myself, um, we get specialized pretty early, and there's big gaps in our knowledge
Mm.
of the history of philosophy. And I'm always discovering these pockets of really interesting stuff that I didn't know anything about.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going the reverse way where I 89 hours or whatever of his history of philosophy. And now I'm realizing I need to learn how to argue better. I need to do some of this. I need to specialize a little bit more. So working on remedying that. Before I want to get to Lewis, you have so many awesome acquaintances, so many cool stories too. I just wanted to ask a little bit about Chisholm, because you studied with him, right?
Sure, yeah, he was my advisor. I met him the first time in the summer of 1986.
Okay.
I just visited Brown when I was with my parents in Connecticut to see my aunt and uncle, and so we stopped at Brown, and he just happened to be there. I had a meeting with Ernie Souza, and Chisholm just happened to be there, so I got to meet him, and eventually decided, the next year went to grad school there,
Yeah.
and
Well, who we didn't. I think the story that I've heard was that like were you studying with Quine and you left Quine to be with Chisholm, or did you
no,
leave someone to be with Chisholm?
no, I went to Brown to work with Chisholm.
Okay, okay, from the
Uh,
start.
I
Nice.
I only ever like I bumped into Quine at a on an escalator at
Okay,
an APA meeting in the 80s,
nice.
and I went to a couple of talks he gave, but um, that's the closest I got to
Okay, okay.
uh,
Uh, so what'd you do? What'd you end up writing your dissertation on under Chisholm there?
Mereological essentialism.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah. Is that a view you still like? Do you hold that or?
yeah, yeah, I
Okay,
do. Yeah,
okay, nice.
um,
Th- Your
it's a good tough view. Like
it
it's
is, yeah.
really
Yeah,
kind of kind of hardcore.
it's hardcore. So hardcore and tough are words that the youngsters now are calling based. It's a based view. It's kind of like the Gen Zers are making up all sorts of language. I'm trying to keep up with them. Yeah. So that's fantastic. Your breadth of work is so vast that we could get sucked into all sorts of different areas where you specialize. But I want to talk about David Lewis because that's kind of how our relationship, our interaction has sparked up. So Barry Lamb had this podcast on it's Hi-Fi Nation. It's a great podcast. Barry's been on my podcast,
Yeah,
and he
it's
did like a
terrific.
yeah.
He's
It's
really
really
good.
great, and he did like a sub series called Man of Many Worlds short mini series on David Lewis, and really excellent podcast. And you said that to me as well. Um, but he mentioned this kind of like beef, this kind of disagreement and animosity that Lewis might have had with Christians of his time, his Christian peers. And you were just mentioning in a group like not so much, maybe not quite the story, even though that might be the popular story.
Yeah. Um, in a way, Lewis. So I went to Brown because I really liked Chisholm's work. I'd been studying his work in epistemology and
Hmm,
read some of his metaphysics, and I thought, I like this. I really
yeah,
like it. I mean, I think this seems right. um, and um, so that was, that was very smooth sailing. And Jaegwon Kim was there, and Jim Van Cleve, and Ernie Souza, and just all wonderful teachers. And I just clicked with all of them very much. But then we grad students had a reading group with Jim Van Cleve, and we read On the Plurality of Worlds by David Lewis, which had just come out, and I read the thing, and I thought, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever read.
The old incredulous stare. Yeah.
I couldn't. Now, I'd read papers by David Lewis as an undergrad. I'd read something of his on functionalism, I suppose, or some kind of identity theory. One of his earlier papers, and then I'd read some other stuff in grad school, but just philosophy of mind. And so I just had not encountered the actual, modal metaphysics until I read that book. And, I did not, I guess I'd read stuff in Lux's anthology about modality, whatever that anthology is called, possible, what is it? Possible Worlds. I can see it up on my, the possible and the actual.
Nice.
Michael Lux.
Okay.
That was a classic collection of papers on modality, which everybody had to study back in the 70s and 80s. You read everything in that anthology. And I just, I read the stuff on counterpart theory in there and so on. And I really it didn't dawn on me that he was serious about other worlds until I read On the Plurality of Worlds. And I didn't fully appreciate the book, I have to say.
Yeah.
It didn't really, the significance of the program didn't really sink in. Kind of the breadth of the vision and the way in which his picture of the space of possible worlds and how they work, it's sort of connected up with all these other areas where he's made significant contributions, philosophical contributions, and it makes it this entire, it's this whole system. And Chisholm's the kind of guy who says, the one book of philosophy that has the most truth in it is Reed's collected works. Just take that.
Yeah, comment it, right.
So somebody asked, some distinguished alum of Brown asked him the question, what's the book with the most the philosophy book with the most truths in it? And that's the one he came up with.
Okay.
So this, although Lewis would think of himself as preserving all the things we ordinarily say, kind of ordinary beliefs, he was willing to accept a very rich and kind of shocking ontology to do it. Something that, a real common sense person like Reed would not have.
But Lewis's whole thing was like, it was the explanatory power that it had, right? So he could say within Quine's naturalized picture, where he's making modal claims, non-modal, because you're grounding him in the concrete things. But I never really thought about that till recently, that he was still following Quine in having this naturalized picture. He's naturalizing modality.
I mean, in some ways he was like Quine, but in other ways very much not.
Okay.
So when it comes to modality, kind of the suspicion of modal notions and the idea that they need to be reduced into some language that's not, doesn't have boxes and diamonds. that idea is certainly there. His attitude towards de re modality and essences
Mm-hmm.
is similar in some ways. It's kind of deflationary.
Yeah.
So, Quine thinks it's just not legitimate talk. It's too messy. He has the example of a bicyclist is essentially a biped, but Jones, the bicyclist, is not essentially a biped. Could undergo some accident, and Quine just thinks, all of our talk about what's essential to somebody or a thing, and what's not, is undisciplined in this kind of way. You think about it one way, it seems essential. You think about it another way, it's not.
Right.
You can see the spirit of that being preserved in counterpart theory,
Mm-hmm.
where it's contextually flexible, whether something counts as a counterpart of me. You think about me as an organism. I couldn't survive teletransportation. If you think of me as a consciously continuing kind of mental entity, even if I'm a physical object, that I still can survive teletransportation because thinking of me that way, there's possible worlds where a counterpart of me makes the jump.
Yeah. Still
So
survives. Yeah.
so you have that aspect of Quine, but you actually have a positive proposal for making sense of that kind of talk.
Yeah.
So Quine thinks it's all too. We should just throw it out.
Yeah.
But Lewis maintains the flexibility, doesn't take essences that seriously.
Yeah.
But we're able to talk about essences and what's necessary and so on. But the way in which he's really unlike Quine, I think, is Quine is sort of a behaviorist about a lot.
Yeah.
And he's a behaviorist about language. And David Lewis takes language really seriously, and we need theories of it that take account of meanings, and that we need to our the language that we are trying to make precise and that we think is going to be used to state the real truth about things.
Yeah.
It better be able to state the real truth about language and meaning and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Intentionality, where Quine basically lets all that stuff go.
Okay.
That's my interpretation of what he's doing in like word and object.
Yeah. That sounds right. Yeah. Well, so you've met a lot of these giants of the last century. Can you fill us in on like your interaction with Lewis?
Yeah. So in a way, as Chisholm became less able to do philosophy after I moved to Notre Dame, that was my first job after grad school. He became sick. He had cancer. He had to have surgery. He was weak, and his eyesight was failing, and just everything was going downhill.
Yeah.
It's very sad. I did get to visit him a couple of times, go back, and but by then he was in the nursing home and not doing well at all. Meanwhile, my reading of Lewis had increased, and I finally got a chance to interact with him at Notre Dame, and then at quite a few other occasions and contexts in the mid 90s. And boy, I took a completely different attitude towards On the Plurality of Worlds. I started to see the kind of beauty of it, even though, I still think it's it's a bizarre metaphysics that I could never kind of get myself into a frame of mind to believe it.
Yeah.
It has this kind of beauty to it, like Leibniz or Berkeley or Russell's metaphysics in Our Knowledge of the External World, where he builds up physical objects and minds from the same stuff.
Yeah.
And he's got these spheres of phenomenal experiences, and some of those are ones that we experience, some are not. And those other things are points of space.
Yeah. Is that where he develops what's come to be known as Russellian panpsychism?
That's that's one version of that view. I think he changes his views quite a bit.
Yeah,
but that one that's my favorite, and it's also wild, and there's it's deeply unbelievable. But it has the same sort of attractiveness to me as Lewis's picture. But Lewis's picture does so much more. It's connected to his ability to explain what's going on with minds, matter, intentionality, language, modal talk of all kinds, and causation, and laws of nature, etc., etc. Lots of his projects would be hard to fully carry out without this metaphysics. Lots of what he did philosophically is independent of it. You can appreciate you can appreciate the theory. You can even make use of it without all the worlds.
And probably his stuff on time travel, right? Like you don't need the plurality of worlds for that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I'm guessing your listeners are familiar with David Lewis and modality and possible worlds. So we're just taking that.
Yeah. Most of them will be just really quick. Maybe if you're not, you can go listen to the episode with Barry Lamb, because we talked about that was our whole conversation. But if you're not familiar, there's these discrete universes, and you can't interact with them. But there are possible worlds, and they're actually concrete worlds. They're not abstract. And so right now there's a world where literally where my counterpart, it's not actually me, but someone who's very close to me, doesn't have a mustache, but is talking with that counterpart version of Dean Zimmerman on their podcast in their world. But I can never reach them. It's not like the Marvel series where you can transport yourself, or you can find a black hole and get into another universe. They're discrete. You can't get to them.
Yeah. And you might wonder, okay, yeah, that's a crazy idea. Why is that important? Why isn't that just science fiction? But it's not, because it is part of a theory that is very similar to extremely popular and essentially necessary for metaphysics theories about modality. So if you're thinking about modality, that is necessity and possibility, and related ideas like counterfactuals. If so and so would have happened, this would have happened. If you're thinking about those notions, which are just core to metaphysics, you end up thinking about possible worlds.
Right.
And even if you even if you don't think modality is really about possible worlds, you still end up with possible worlds.
Right.
If modality is just about propositions and whether they're necessary or uh, uh, or or merely possible or impossible, still, you take enough propositions together that describe a complete way that everything could go, and you have a possible world.
Right.
So anybody who works on modality at all ends up with possible worlds.
Yeah.
And then they have to explain what they are. Or they have an explanation. They're an abstract thing that they ended up with because they think modalities, necessity and possibility, these are properties that propositions
Yeah.
possess. What Lewis offers us is a way to use possible worlds to reduce modal notions so that they just essentially go away. You can replace talk about necessity and possibility with just talk about what there is.
Yeah.
And um, and it's a lovely view. And
Yeah.
but he treats these possible worlds in order for it to work. He treats these possible worlds as concrete places that we can't get to.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really interesting too. The way you explain that it's a bit inescapable to use possible world language and semantics, because if we're saying, hey, look, is it necessary? Does Parker have to have a mustache? Well, no, he doesn't have to. Well, how do you know that? Well, because you can imagine this exact scenario without Parker having a mustache. Ceteris paribus or ceteris paribus. Everything else is the same except for the mustache. Well, if that's one proposition or two propositions, those encompass an entire possible world, which is not the one that we live in now. And so Lewis is just saying that place exists. All I'm saying is that place exists, and many, many more of them.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. Well, so you got more into Lewis and you started to appreciate his possible worlds type stuff, his modal realism. But the kind of popular picture is that Lewis had some friction with Christian philosophers. And I imagine that's probably you. Like you were a Christian philosopher. You were in that time zone, but it doesn't seem like you were having any friction with him.
Yeah. Well, so I never heard anyone ever suggest that Lewis had any animosity towards Christian philosophers my entire life.
Okay. Wow.
until Barry's podcast.
Okay.
So I don't think that there is I don't think he had a reputation for that among
Okay.
people who knew him.
Yeah.
In fact, really, if anything, quite the opposite.
Huh.
So I did get to become friends with him and with Steffi and with David Armstrong and
Oh, cool.
Jenny Armstrong. And one thing that Steffi said to me shortly after he passed away, she invited me to be one of the eulogists at
Wow.
his memorial service, which is an extremely, a huge honor.
Yeah.
But also so difficult because everybody knew and loved him.
Yeah.
And it was such a tragedy.
Yeah.
So it was very difficult to do. But one of the things she said to me when we were talking about what I would say and so on was, isn't it remarkable that although she and David had really, as she put it, not a religious bone in our bodies,
Mm-hmm.
we have so many friends, and so many of David's friends were, really quite religious.
Hmm.
And I think among their closer friends in philosophy were Phil Quinn, in particular. They were very close to Phil. and when Phil became ill, Steffi went to South Bend to be with him.
Wow.
As did Eleanor Stump, um, a really interesting pair of angels.
Yeah. Yeah. Seriously. Wow.
Watching over Phil,
Yeah.
and you know, he and Bob Adams were, were friendly forever. He and Al Plantinga were, I don't think that they were ever friends, but
Okay.
they liked one another. They were
Huh.
cordial. They exchanged a lot of letters back and forth. I mean, David was a difficult person to get to know.
Okay.
He was extremely slow to speak. He disliked small talk intensely. He really couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so it was, there were always long, awkward pauses.
Mm.
And so if you were just an acquaintance like Al, um, you interacted with him, at conferences and so on, and you wrote letters back and forth, but you didn't hang out.
Right.
And but they had very friendly exchanges. Keith DeRose as well.
Mm.
There's going to be a book of his correspondence on philosophy of religion.
Oh, awesome.
And Anthony Fisher is preparing that, and he and Steffi were working on it together.
Okay.
Before she passed away. But anyway, getting back to like the long list, Peter Van Inwagen, David Lewis and Peter Van Inwagen were a sort of mutual admiration society. They really liked one another a lot.
Wow.
So I would never have said that there was any, also younger people. So, I think our relationship started off a little prickly because I sent him a paper that was very critical of his argument from temporary intrinsics.
Okay.
And he really didn't like that. And I was proposing to publish it in this metaphysics book that Peter and I put together. And he sent me a long letter, criticizing it. And I made some changes, but I still thought that's a terrible argument,
Yeah.
And one of these letters, he's the first letter to me about the paper, he said, of course, whether you publish it or not is your business, but can I ask that you show it to Peter? And show this correspondence to Peter, something like that. So he really did not like that paper. I thought it was successful, and it's been anthologized a couple times.
Okay.
I think most people think, yeah, that's not a very good argument.
Yeah.
for temporal parts. But our then we became really friendly as he visited Notre Dame a couple times, and then he and David Armstrong for several years spent a weekend at Franklin and Marshall, where David Armstrong would spend a semester.
Okay.
And David Lewis and Steffi would come down, and David and Steffi and David and Jenny would get to hang out, and they were very friendly with Michael Murray and other philosophers at Franklin and Marshall. So I started getting invited to that, and I did about 3 of those, and including one after David Lewis passed away, but 2 while he was still part of that. And David was very friendly with Michael Murray, another Christian philosopher.
Yeah.
Trenton Merrick's. I'm trying to think who else was at these. There was an unusual number of Christian philosophers at these events because Michael Murray was, I think, the one maybe Bruce Russell as well, were putting it together.
Okay.
Anyway, so I got to know him better, and these contexts were really, nice ones in which to get to know him and Steffi, because it was a comfortable sort of setting. A lot of people, all these people knew one another, liked one another, and as long as Steffi was around, she could kind of help carry the burden of the conversation,
That makes sense.
and he could just relax and have a beer and sing an Australian drinking song occasionally. I did get to hear a couple of those, which were amazing.
That's awesome.
But then he started coming to the Metaphysical Mayhem at Notre Dame in, I think it was 99 was the first one he came to. So I think he came in 99, 2000, 2001. And those are great. Those were great events. They were, like 5 days, lots of parties. The principal people who came to that included, again, a lot of Christian philosophers.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of people from Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the idea that he had a kind of deep-seated animosity or grudge or something.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that was pointed out in the podcast was that there was a lot of controversy involving Plantinga, attacking some view of David's, or vice versa, or debates between him and Christian philosophers. This isn't surprising at all. I mean, everybody attacked his views, and it's just what you do. Sure. And there was a surprising number of Christian philosophers in metaphysics.
Yeah.
In his generation, and subsequent ones too. So it's natural that these there'd be a great deal of controversy between David Lewis and the Christians, just like there would be a lot of controversy between David Lewis and the non-Christian metaphysicians.
Right.
I mean, if you're a metaphysician or a philosopher of mind or philosopher of language or whatever, you're going to find yourself involved in debates with David Lewis, because he touched all these areas, and epistemology too. Yeah. He gave his elusive knowledge paper at Notre Dame while I was there. So I mean, he of course contributed to so many fields. Anyway,
yeah, legendary the amount of fingers in different pies he had. I always think of him and Chisholm as kind of like polar opposite type figures, where they're both working in so many different fields, but they just take different starting points. And Lewis is kind of out there, and Chisholm seems super grounded. And maybe that's because I agree with most of his positions or whatever. But was there much of a dust up between Chisholm and Lewis?
No, I think Lewis was kind of the next generation.
Okay.
Chisholm was more, Chisholm was in grad school at Harvard when Quine came out of grad school and started there as a assistant professor. I think maybe one of them might have rented a house from the other, or apartment from the other, or something. Anyway, but Quine was, I think, a little older.
Okay.
Lewis was, how old was he when he died? 60. It's so sad. Mm-hmm. How old was he? 62, maybe?
Something like that. I remember him being a young man in philosopher land, just kind of in prime, seems like. Yeah.
And as far as his work goes too, he was still in his prime. And,
right.
Chisholm, when he died, he was close to 90, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. He was in his 80s anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So
next
20 generation.
20 plus years ahead.
Yeah.
but also, their approaches to metaphysics were very different,
Yeah.
and Chisholm was not um, he was not a super technical philosopher. I mean, he was very careful in his definitions and so on, but uh, but he was not interacting with philosophy of language in the
Oh, okay.
way that not in the same way that Lewis was. So
Okay.
Lewis was willing to kind of really get in there with linguists, people doing semantics,
Yeah.
and Chisholm was certainly interested in language and how does language hook up with the world, but he didn't, he didn't have a philosophy of language in the same way that David Lewis did.
Okay. Okay. Well, so
I think Lewis early on was well known for technical work in modal logic
okay.
and um, semantics for conditionals
Yeah.
and counterfactuals. And Chisholm had an important paper on counterfactuals and laws of nature early on, but it was an earlier time,
Okay.
and it was later that Lewis kind of exploded on the scene, and he was exploding in areas that Chisholm really didn't work in, and
Okay.
so it was kind of only later that you could sort of look at their metaphysical systems and compare them.
Oh, yeah. Now you can look back and compare, their philosophy of mind or something like that, but it didn't quite work out.
Yeah, it
until-
just didn't happen that they
Yeah.
interacted much.
Okay. Well, so if you listen to this podcast and you hear the story of Lewis and you becoming friends with them, and Lewis's interaction with other Christian philosophers, you get a different feel than if you only read this paper by David Lewis called Divine Evil, which is kind of by him, kind of not. It seems like maybe Philip Kitcher turned an outline of Lewis's into a paper, maybe. But there's this paper on divine evil, and I took it to be just this argument from hell, saying that if God were to
You could interpret that in two ways. An argument from hell. Oh, that's the argument from hell. The worst I've ever encountered.
It's from hell. Yeah. Well, the fact that God would send people to eternal torment. But then there's this. So that's one point. You might go, okay, well, now it's the apologist's turn to respond. But he's got the second part where it's like, should we admire believers? And it seems like he's saying no, we shouldn't. You could look at a believer, a Christian believer who's actually following the tenets of Christ and say, oh, he's a pretty good man. But he's saying, look, if you in the paper, it's like you wouldn't say that about a Nazi if he's following Hitler. He's a bad person for following Hitler. And so if God is perpetrating divine evil, then the person who's following that God is likewise not admirable. And so if you just read this paper, you'd be like, yeah, Lewis doesn't like Christians.
Yeah.
What's the deal here?
Yeah. You would be forgiven for getting that impression.
Yeah.
So the way the argument goes is first of all, he says, and this is not an implausible thing to say,
Mm-hmm.
that a God who would condemn people to an eternity of punishment,
Yeah.
for at worst a finite amount of sinning, would be worse than Hitler. I mean, that
Yeah.
is not an implausible thing to say. And Lewis felt that if somebody really believes that that's how God operates, then they are essentially a devil worshiper.
Yeah.
And this being can be ever so great in ever so many other ways, but if that's how God operates, it's abominable.
Yeah.
And I think I think it is, I think Christians who believe in hell need to think really hard and seriously about that.
Yeah.
And because it does seem crazy to me, when I think about it. And the way Lewis responded to it, I bumped into something. Let's see if I can find it on my computer here.
Mm-hmm.
I bumped into something by George MacDonald on penal substitution. And so David Lewis also wrote a little bit on penal substitution. He corresponded with Phil Quinn about it, and he he pointed out that although penal substitution seems just like really wrong, nevertheless, it also seems like we all kind of believe in it too, in some cases, when we allow somebody else like to pay my fine for me. And which was an interesting point. Not one of his bigger papers, but he was interested in the doctrine. But anyway, George MacDonald says, they say first, God must punish the sinner for justice requires it. Then they say he does not punish the sinner, but punishes a perfectly righteous man instead, attributes his righteousness to the sinner, and so continues just. Was there ever such a confusion, such an inversion of right and wrong? Justice could not treat a righteous man as an unrighteous. Neither, if justice required the punishment of sin, could justice let the sinner go unpunished. To lay the pain upon the righteous in the name of justice is simply monstrous. No wonder unbelief is rampant. Believe in Moloch, if you will, but call him Moloch, not justice. So MacDonald has the idea that the doctrine of penal substitution is so contrary to righteousness that to attribute it to God and then tell people they've got to believe it is like asking them to worship Moloch. They're devil worshippers, he says. And Lewis had the same idea about hell, and George MacDonald, of course, would have agreed with him completely on that.
Was he a universalist, MacDonald?
Yes, he was. And I'm sure he would have said this. I'm sure somewhere he does say the same kind of thing, that it's a doctrine that's that's a horrible thing to promulgate. Now, the fact is, though, that it's been central to Christianity, since day one, essentially.
Right.
And it's tough to understand the. It's hard to. Universalism has its. Is defensible, I think, biblically, but there are extremely difficult parables of Christ.
Yeah,
and I think they do pose a problem for the goodness of God, even if they're to be explained away in some way, because lots and lots of people have felt required to believe that God operates on a very bizarre and seemingly unjust kind of unjust sort of way. So that's the big, the first point in the paper, and then this last point which you mentioned is that to admire a devil worshiper is problematic. And so how is it that I can admire people who clear-headedly believe this sort of thing?
Right.
and doesn't it sort of spread the stain to me? And there's a way of reading that part of the paper as really as though he's seriously grappling with this, how do I admire these people when they believe this awful thing, and I'm not sure that I can.
Right.
Um,
And many of whom, and that would have you in mind. Like, you would be one of the
yeah,
targets there
yeah,
because you're
I
his
would,
friend. Yeah.
yeah. And but well, for one thing, the paper doesn't read quite like that.
Mhm.
So here's the actual paper. Here's it's just 3 pages of notes here.
Oh, okay.
And it has been published somewhere now. Unfortunately, I cannot remember where that is.
Mhm.
Anthony Fisher told me, but
Okay.
then I forgot.
The internet hive mind will find it, no doubt.
They'll find it. They will
Someone
find
put it in the comments if you guys find it. Yeah.
And we know from correspondence that he had, that he sent it to Kitcher, and Philip Kitcher, who then after Lewis's death wrote up the essay that was published.
Yeah.
And he also sent it to Mark Johnston. And I asked Mark about this, and he said, "Oh, you mean that shameful paper in which it seems like he says Bob Adams is a devil worshiper?"
Yeah, that one.
And I said, yeah, that one. And he said, "Yes, I talked with him about it, and I convinced him not to publish it." Now, apparently, either David changed his mind or never told Steffi about that conversation.
Sure.
But that's how Mark remembered it.
Okay.
Anyway. But it was something he was thinking of publishing.
Okay.
And after his death, Steffi and Philip Kitcher were going through papers and finding, things that might outlines, things that might be publishable. And Philip then filled it out. And there's a footnote to that paper where Philip
I saw that at the end. Yeah.
I tried to use words from this outline, but that's a really long essay compared to this outline. So
Okay.
it's mostly Philip and things that he says he had 2 conversations with David about it.
Okay.
So, but anyway, when you get to that part, so I don't want to underplay how seriously David thought the problem of divine evil marred Christianity.
Yeah.
So I think he thought that people who believed in a literal hell, or something as bad as a literal hell that goes on and on forever, and then worshipped the being that sent people there.
Yeah.
Were were in some sense devil worshippers. But what isn't so clear from the essay is how he thought this affected his attitudes towards towards Christians.
Sure.
So for one thing, he I'm looking for this note here. So for one thing, he did, he was aware that most of the philosophers that he knew who were Christians did not believe in the sort of hell that was most problematic.
Okay.
So this was a letter to Jonathan Bennett around this in October of 2001, he said, "I've become increasingly surprised that philosophers pay so much attention to the evils that God declines to prevent." So in other words, the normal problem of evil.
Right.
"But ignore the evils God himself allegedly perpetrates. Of course, few, if any, members of the Society of Christian Philosophers believe that God punishes insubordination with eternal torment. But very many of our neighbors do believe it, and very many admired historical figures did too. I reckon they're all devil worshippers, like neo-Nazis who adore Hitler, only worse."
Wow. Yeah.
So he thinks it's a huge, serious problem.
Yeah.
He doesn't think it infects his relationships with Christians in the Society of Christian Philosophers, because he, rightly or wrongly, thinks that no, I think rightly, thinks that most of them don't believe in an infinitely bad punishment,
Yeah.
a punishment of infinite awfulness for some people.
Yeah. I
So
wonder.
that's
Yeah.
one thing,
Yeah.
So, but another thing is that the actual content, which I'll talk about in a second, of his
Yeah.
outline is a bit different, I think, than
Okay.
the final version.
Okay. Okay. I wondered about that finite crimes and eternal punishment bit.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's anything to the response that like it well, you could go with C.S. Lewis and say you've never met a mere mortal. So these finite crimes are against infinite beings, and so it might warrant infinite punishment. I don't know. That's kind of muddled. It's a little bit vague to draw out why a finite crime against an immortal being would warrant eternal punishment. But if again, likewise, people will point that to God and say, look, every sin is ultimately against God. You see that in the Bible. David says, "Against you and you alone have I sinned," even though he had took advantage of Bathsheba and had her husband killed and all sorts of crazy stuff, lied about it. But God's this eternal being or everlasting being, depending on your doctrine of God. And so if you're sinning against an eternal God, then perhaps the punishment is justly eternal, and the payment for it could either be an eternal punishment or a finite punishment against an eternal being, like the Son of God or something. Is there anything there, or is that just kind of grasping at straws?
I mean, certainly God's way different from us. Our obligations to God are different than our obligations to one another.
Mm-hmm.
I can see thinking that they must be deeper and more profound.
Okay.
It's something like the way, if I'm rude to a stranger, that's one thing. If I'm rude to my wife or my father or something like that, that's something else.
Right.
It's sort of
Right.
worse. I owe them so much, and then I treat them like that.
Right.
So I can see thinking that there's something far worse about um, offending against, an offense against God. But I don't see how it is that an offense against God in this life, calling God a bad name, or knowing that he wants me to do something and not doing it, or shaking my fist at God even.
Yeah. High-handed. Yeah.
How why it is that God's being eternal would turn that into an offense that requires an infinite amount of torture.
Hmm.
I'm just not really seeing it.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that there's theology out there that explains this
Right. Right.
in the vicinity of what you're pointing to. I've encountered it.
Yeah.
I kind of, I didn't get it.
Sure.
Um, but I realize that I'm not a theologian, and
Mm.
especially here, it's not. I have not encountered serious, deep attempts to justify the idea that we manage to incur a kind of um,
Eternal debt or something.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so there's most people writing about hell that I've encountered anyway um, seem to take it that we've got to find a way of explaining this that doesn't require that.
Huh. Yeah.
So in the C.S. Lewis picture where the doors are closed from the
Locked from the
inside,
inside. Yeah.
the idea there is this could only go on and on if it even is allowed to go on and on, because that's not totally clear from Lewis's kind of metaphor.
Yeah. Someone pops out of existence. Right. Yeah.
If it's allowed to go on and on, that's because it's willfully being chosen,
Right.
and so that doesn't depend upon having done something that merits an extreme length of horrible punishment.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Well, that's really good. So folks listening, if you take that seriously, that what the view that I brought up, then write it up. Let's see it. Yeah, let's do some more work on it and make it at least write it up. I guess that's what I'm saying.
I think places to look for discussion of this would be Jerry Wall's book on hell.
Yeah.
And well, he's got several books now.
Yeah. Including Purgatory and all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is we've got this here. Hell, the Logic of Damnation.
Nice.
But anyway, where were we going with this?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll get Jerry to come on.
Yeah.
That'd be a fun one too. I wanted to if we got a little bit more time for me here, Dean.
Actually, we should probably just do the thing that Lewis actually says.
Oh, right. You said about the content. The content of the actual outline might be a little bit different.
So what he actually says is are those who worship the perpetrator of divine evil. So people who really think this is how God's economy operates.
Yeah.
He creates these creatures, he gives them a chance to sin or not, to love him or not. And if they don't, he gives them a finite amount of time to do their bad stuff and then punishes them horribly for eternity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So somebody really, really believes that and that it's, that's sort of, it's God's right to do that. That's what God wants. That's what God likes. It's his way of operating. So he thinks that sort of person is worshiping a being that does something which they should be able to see is unconscionable, So he says, what about that sort of person? A neo-Nazi who admires Hitler is evil. Okay. Not necessarily because he's disposed to emulate Hitler's deeds, but just because he approves of this.
Yeah.
And just approving of it makes the person stained in a way.
Yeah. Just
So
that pro attitude.
yeah.
Good
So
deal.
then he asks, well, some worshippers of this kind of God would be obviously evil if they relish contemplating the torment of the damned.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
That would be a bad thing. And then he says, others are not obviously evil, and yet they knowingly worship this being, believing the being operates this way, and that's, he says, that's bad enough. Now it's not totally clear what bad enough means, how bad that makes them.
Right.
But I think he thinks it does make them, to some extent, bad.
Yeah.
You know? Okay. And then he says, what of those who admire worshippers of the perpetrator? Say by admiring some of our neighbors, or by admiring famous saints or heroes or scholars, Mother Teresa, Father Murphy, or Buridan. So he's wondering, oh, wait a minute. So some of these people do, so our neighbors, maybe not members of the Society of Christian Philosophers, or not many of them, he says in that letter, but some people that I admire, like Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
And then he asks, and what of those who admire them?
Right. Yeah, the stain could go out another level.
It keeps going, right? If
Yeah.
admiration transmits evil, so does ancestral admiration.
Mm.
Chains of contagion can be of arbitrary length. Getting hooked up to one is well nigh unavoidable. Okay. So it's not going to go away, he says. Even if someday there are no more worshippers of the perpetrator, or any who remember those worshippers, or any who remember them, you're still going to get hooked up to a chain that goes back.
Wow.
And so unless, he says, you are an utter misanthrope, you're going to be connected by one of these chains.
Yeah.
Now, then he says, this is getting ridiculous, not to mention depressing. And clearly it is ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that, let's say 1,000 years from now, after, let's suppose belief in a God like that has completely gone away. Nobody even remembers it. But still, people admire people who admired people who admired Augustine.
Right.
And so if we're really going to think that it spreads like that, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Right? So he says, this is getting ridiculous. How can it be morally permissible to be tolerant and jovial with your neighbors who actually do believe in this kind of God? As of course it is. So that's the next line.
As of course it is. Yeah.
As of course it is.
Yeah.
What saves us from chains of contagion? Well, he's got some things that would do that. So admiration transmits evil only if it is well informed. So, if you don't know that somebody thought of God in this way,
don't ask them about their beliefs on hell, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Only if it's unconfused and free of doublethink, which it almost never is.
Okay.
He didn't say almost never is, but
some cognitive dissonance going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's unselective, as opposed to admiring one aspect but not another. So you can admire somebody you can admire Mother Teresa for all sorts of things, but you don't admire her for her willingness to accept this doctrine of hell, let's say.
Sure.
And of course, who knows what Mother Teresa really thought about hell?
Right.
There'd be a lot of options open for a Catholic even of her generation, although, that's a while ago still.
Sure.
So those are all things that break the chains. If these conditions fail at any step, the chain is broken, and probably they mostly do. That's the end of the thing. But so it's a very different. Now, Kitcher is making points that he makes, that David Lewis makes, but the flavor of it is very different. And the how can we remain tolerant and jovial, as of course we should. You don't get that at all from from the Kitcher version.
Right.
So I thought I'd get that out there. I also
Yeah.
have a little thing that Steffi wrote for a workshop that she did a couple of years after David's death, where she talked about David Lewis and his correspondence with Christian philosophers.
Okay.
But
Awesome.
I don't need to read that. It's not terribly it's not terribly deep, but it does talk about how how he had many philosophical friends, Bob Adams and she includes Plantinga and Keith DeRose and Phil Quinn and so on. Bruce Langtry in Australia.
Oh, it's good. It's good they got an Australian in there, because I know his affinity for Australia.
Yeah, he was a big fan of Australians.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Dean, I thought maybe we could finish up just briefly with modal realism and theism, because that's something that I've talked about on the podcast before. Just initially, I don't know if this has happened, but looking at Plantinga's modal ontological argument, he's saying God is a necessary being. He doesn't use that language, but close. If God's this necessary being and you allow him to exist in any possible world, then he necessarily exists in every possible world. And if you let him in once, he gets in everywhere.
Yeah.
And I wondered about Lewis's view, like, because he holds in his modal realism, I think he said in places that, look, there's different possible worlds that are actual, different concrete worlds where Eastern religions are true, where Christianity is true. It just doesn't happen to be this one that our index calls are latched onto or whatever. But if that's the case, then there is a possible world where Plantinga's God, who is necessarily existent, exists, which seems like it then would spread out to all of them. Did Lewis and Plantinga talk about this, or?
I do not know that they did. I would think they might have. So there's correspondence. There will be correspondence in this book. Between Plantinga and David, and Steffi shared some of it at that workshop.
Okay.
I guess it was the first David Lewis lecture.
Yeah.
That they had, and then she did this thing. And Cornel West was there, and it was a big moment for me because Cornel. It was a small room. It was like a little seminar room, and he said something about we Christians like Dean and me, and I didn't even know he knew my name or who knew me from Adam.
Yeah, right.
So that was a big moment. Wow,
that's pretty cool.
Cornel West knows my name. it was a sweet moment.
Yeah.
Anyway, she read out a letter from Plantinga, or a letter to Plantinga and from Plantinga, but it was all about free will theodicy, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think I after listening to the podcast, Barry's podcast, he asked Megan Sullivan. She was one of my PhD students. Actually.
Oh, okay.
Wow. He asked her, now of course super distinguished philosopher. Do you think that Christians had trouble with his metaphysics because modal realism was so incompatible with theism?
Yeah.
And she talked about it a little bit and kind of said, I kind of but it sounded to me like she was struggling a bit to see what was really wrong here, and listening to that made me want to look into the literature on it, which I did a little bit. And there is some now. There's a kind of growing literature, it looks like.
Yeah.
And you had somebody on your podcast talking about.
Yeah, Joshua Sijuare. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome guy.
Yeah, that was so I read his paper,
Oh,
and
cool.
then stuff by Ross Cameron,
Yeah.
and I guess Sheehy
I'm not
is
sure.
is a guy who's criticized it.
Oh, cool.
So he
Okay.
says it won't work.
Okay.
Or Sheehy, Sheehy. Anyway.
Okay.
In religious studies, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah, so you might think you couldn't run the Plantinga sort of argument in Lewis's setup, because, or if you did, you'd get really crazy results.
Yeah.
Right. So it, the official story is, when you're asking about something's possible or necessary properties, you look at its counterparts in other possible worlds.
Yeah.
So the natural way to read the Plantinga argument is like this: possibly there's a necessarily existing perfectly good being, with omnipotence and omniscience essentially as well. That means there's some possible world where there's a being who's like that.
Yeah.
And there's a counterpart of that being in every other possible world. So it's still a valid argument. It's a valid argument of S5 modal logic.
Yeah.
Probably weaker systems than S5. It's valid.
Well, which I took. I think Lewis has a contrary system, right? He doesn't hold S5, from what I remember.
Let's see. Shoot, I should know this.
Sorry to pop that in on you, because I hardly know, but yeah.
Well, I guess because of counterpart theory, it's probably,
that would make sense.
Yeah, I should be able to just reply to that, but
no worries. I come up with some random ones.
No. That's
I hadn't considered the counterpart thing before, because if we ran Plantinga's model, we'd have to say, well, like the God in this universe is different than the God in even the closest possible world, because counterparts aren't identical. They're counterparts. So it would be like a counterpart God. So like that is kind of a weird take.
Yeah. So it looks like you've got all these gods.
Yeah.
So there's this funny thing about Lewis's reduction. It's very hard to it's very hard. There's difficulties if you want to use modal talk again while you're talking about possible worlds,
because it's already been reduced.
Because it's already been reduced, and you get some bad consequences.
Interesting. Yeah.
So for instance, let's say we're talking the language of possible worlds, which we've used to reduce boxes and diamonds and counterfactuals and so on. Then we can say things like that are just flat out true, like there are disconnected spacetimes. Now, normally, if anything's true, it's possibly true. So you ought to be able to say, so possibly there are disconnected spacetimes.
Right.
But that's not true in Lewis's setup.
Right, because it'd be like a meta modal fact above all what's been reduced.
It's what's possibly true is supposed to be what's true in some possible world or other.
Yeah.
And in no possible world are there these things. So that's a I guess it gets called the puzzle of advanced modalizing or something like that.
Okay.
And I think Joseph Melia might be maybe he was the first to bring it up.
Okay.
but a lot of people have been talking about it for a lot of years now, and there's different responses you can give. I mean, one thing to say, Ted Sider likes this kind of response: don't mix up your languages. um, but anyway, where were we going with this?
Yeah, well, so I think it actually opens up something that you sent me about a simple God, and how a simple God might be able to kind of traverse this difficulty of counterparts. I have just this quote. I think I just pulled it from your Facebook message that you said, a simple God that could only have multiple properties in virtue of extrinsic relations is a good candidate for something that's truly cross-world identical.
Yeah. So the so Lewis's so the problem we ran into for for God being necessarily existing in Lewis' scheme was counterpart theory, which requires individuals, anything that is causing things to happen and has contingent intrinsic properties that are different in different worlds, has to be world bound, he thinks.
Okay.
And so you get all these gods in all these different worlds. And that just feels wrong, like crazy polytheism.
Yeah.
But his reason for thinking that individuals should be world bound, really there's two. One of them is that accidental intrinsic properties will lead to contradiction if you allow for cross-world identity. So if you allow that I'm in this possible world and I intrinsically am seated, I'm in a bent position.
Oh, I remember this. Yeah.
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 Then that's an intrinsic property that I have. And he says, if we can tell anything about intrinsic properties, it's that they're not relations to anything else.
Yeah.
So it's a property I just have, period. And then he says, if you suppose that the possible world that validates the possibility of me standing, not being bent,
in which you are standing,
in which I am standing, that world is that's going to lead to a contradiction if it's really me,
because you're bent and straight leg at the same time.
Bent and straight at the same time. How could that be the same? Well,
same time. Yeah,
we're actually doing the one for temporary intrinsics, which was the argument that I criticized in this early paper of mine.
Yeah.
And that he sort of replied to, but he wants to say the same thing about worlds. So, like, take my whole history. I have this intrinsic shape,
Yeah.
Small, bigger, and then I get stooped, and then I'm done. Okay.
With the different haircuts as well. That's
with
important.
Different haircuts, right? Yeah. All of this is, he thinks, because shape is intrinsic, all of this is intrinsic to me.
Yeah.
Now, if you say that I existed in another possible world and had a different shape over my whole career, that would be a contradiction, because you've said I'm intrinsically one way and I'm intrinsically a contradictory way.
Yeah.
Now, the obvious thing to say, both to the temporary case and to the world case, is that these are relative properties. So relative to this space-time manifold, I have such and such a shape. Relative to that disconnected space-time manifold, I have this other shape.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? Now, Lewis's response is, I can just see that shape is an intrinsic property. But a lot of us think, well, I don't just see that. Couldn't shape be a relation between you and a region?
Yeah.
You have the shape that you have in virtue of your relationship to that region.
Right.
If that's so, then identity across possible worlds is unproblematic. The other reason he likes counterpart theory and the use of things that are not strictly identical to me to make sense of de re modality is just that it allows this kind of flexibility we were talking about early on, where you can say, well, if you think of Dean as an organism, he couldn't survive teletransportation. But if you're thinking of him as a psychological being, he could. And that allows you to be kind of flexible about that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people think, no, essences shouldn't be like that. I mean, there should be just a fact of the matter about whether I could survive teletransportation or not, you know?
Right.
So if you don't accept his argument from accidental intrinsics,
Mhm.
and you don't like this flexibility, then cross-world identity, trans-world identity is makes good sense for everything,
Okay.
you know, for all
Yeah.
sorts of things, and certainly for God.
Hmm.
And that's the way Ross Cameron defends modal realism. He says, you know,
Okay.
and he makes the point that all of God's intrinsic, all of God's essential properties could be intrinsic.
Hmm.
And now you might think, okay, but you know, what about, you know, in this world, God believes that Dean has short hair on such and such a date,
Yeah.
and in this other world, I don't have short hair on that date, so God believes that Dean doesn't have short hair on that date. You know, aren't those incompatible beliefs then?
Yeah.
I mean, you could say, well, the belief is a belief about Dean and Dean's relationship to this world.
Uh-huh.
You know, so it's not just
Oh,
the
yeah.
flat out belief that Dean is
Interesting.
has long hair on such and such a date. It's Dean has long hair on such and such a date in such and such world.
Right, right. And you could still be a counterpart. You could still have two Dean counterparts, even if God's not a counterpart. God doesn't have counterparts.
Well, that's true. We could be modal realists and use counterpart theory for individuals.
Yeah.
Individuals are world bound except for God.
Right.
And you might think, well, God's really special, so God can do that. I mean, Lewis was open to the idea of some special things
Okay.
too,
That's
like
nice.
he never fully decided one way or the other on David Armstrong's kind of universals,
Oh, okay.
but he always left the door open for them.
Yeah.
And they are spatially located wherever their instances are.
Mm-hmm.
And they're certainly causally important. You know,
Yeah.
they you know, it's mass and charge that are responsible for things like gravitation and electromagnetism.
Yeah.
You know? And it's the charge of this electron that's repelling that other electron in virtue of what? Well, in virtue of the universal, which is present in both those places. So he, you know, he left it open that there could be some things that were cross-world identical.
Yeah.
And even, you know, maybe in the case of these universals, they're causally significant in space, space-time.
Yeah.
So,
well, so a simple God. This is interesting. Really interesting. Like a simple God would only have multiple properties in virtue of extrinsic relations. So he could be related to the pluriverse in different ways. Each you know, the depending on the other relata, you know, that relation is going to be different. But it's does that sound right?
yeah, and I mean, one thing that's kind of neat and tidy about this view, if you're a classical theist, where that means, you know, God is simple, God can't change,
Yeah.
God would have been the same no matter what.
Yeah. Impassable, right?
Then you have to make beliefs like, you know, beliefs that seem to be contingent aren't really intrinsic to God.
Right.
They're relations to things out here.
And their conceptual relations when it comes to him. Yeah.
Right. They're relations only from the one side.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that means, by the way.
I don't either, but some of the classical guys,
Yeah, they say that.
Yeah.
So if that was your conception, then it would be really easy to run with this kind of modal realism,
yeah,
because God isn't intrinsically different according to different worlds.
yeah,
Um, uh, God just stands in all these. God's believing that I will do so and so, or God's knowing that I am such and such. That isn't intrinsic to God. It's a relationship between God um, and this fact.
yeah, yeah. Which it's even more fascinating that you brought this up, because if anyone's a neoclassical guy or a theistic personalist or whatever you want to call it, it'd be you. So this is fun that
Yeah.
you're going with the simple idea. It's really
Well, I
interesting.
never said I believe modal
No,
realism.
right, sure. Yeah,
or
if you
or
wanted
this
to,
or this
yeah,
kind of view about God. But
yeah,
I I'm really interested in exploring divine timelessness
yeah,
and immutability and stuff like that, and simplicity as well. I mean, these are ancient, interesting
yeah,
philosophical positions, and
yeah,
um,
and many of which I believe Dr. Leftow holds. Your
yeah, no, he's
co-director.
he his God's definitely outside of time. Um, I suppose I should ask him about immutability. I should know these things.
Well,
Um,
I think he holds the
uh,
simplicity. I was
yeah,
God necessity. He's got this interesting view of conceptualism, conceptual nominalism. I believe. I don't know if he'd call it that, but
yeah,
Craig calls it that. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
um,
So it's nice to have both you guys there as
yeah. No,
co-directors. That's
we
really
have
cool.
very different views, and we like to talk about them.
It's awesome. I
They're
love it. I
fun.
love that
Yeah.
you're interested in the stuff too, because sometimes people think this guy or that guy's the boogeyman. If you're a theistic personalist, I know that's a weird word, but if that's you, then you might think Leftow is the bad guy, and
Oh,
if you're a classical guy, you might think that Dean Zimmerman is the boogeyman. But it's really
yeah.
cool to think that you're just a curious philosopher who's interested in checking stuff out, and you're a Christian, so you check out the ancient views as well, and you're still exploring them. It's
Yeah,
cool.
I'm spending a lot of time on timelessness right now,
Okay,
actually.
awesome.
I mean, I'm really seriously trying to work out a kind of tense logic that will be, it'll make the A theory compatible with divine eternity. And
Okay.
it's extremely hard. But Brian wants to do this too. And so we're both working on it. And
Awesome.
but it's tricky. But I also want to make sense of so if you're an atheist, you've got to have you need to treat tense like a modal operator.
Okay.
If
Yeah.
you especially if you're a presentist, because you
Yep.
want to make a big distinction between um, you know it used to be that there's a dinosaur,
Yep.
and there's a thing that used to be a dinosaur, because you want to say that's false.
Yeah.
And if you're going to do that, you got to think there's a scope distinction.
Okay.
There's a big distinction between um, uh, there's a thing that was a dinosaur, where the was is in the scope of the quantifier there
Yep.
is.
Yeah.
And the other thing I said,
Yeah. Lest you
which
quantify over this dinosaur that's supposed to be back there.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you have to treat tense as something that works like an operator, so that you can make that kind of distinction.
Okay.
But then if you want to say that timelessness is kind of another mode of being,
Uh-huh.
and then that's a good candidate for an operator as well. And then you got to explain how these interact with one another.
And then you gotta, say why it's not Meinongianism or something, because that's like a terrible thing to be.
Yeah, no, don't be accused of that.
Yeah.
Meinong too was a great philosopher,
Yeah.
a really great philosopher.
Yeah.
But I want to work on this, not just because I want to see if Leftow's project of making timelessness and presentism compatible,
Uh-huh.
whether that will work. But I also want to work on it because I want to test out Bill Craig's picture, where the past is finite, presentism is true now, God exists in time now, but God also timelessly existed and created. So God doesn't just have a finite past. That's the important thing for him.
Right.
So he wants to introduce a kind of mode of being, timelessness, that God can have, as well as the kind of temporal life that God has now.
Yeah,
and to make sense of that, you got to have a timelessness operator that functions like a tense.
And that goes away once God creates time, right?
Well, so that's one of the things that makes the view really hard to understand is that it tempts you to say things like, God has been in time since the beginning of time, and before that, God was timeless. But God isn't timeless now.
Right.
And that's obviously no good. You can't say that. So you have to say timelessly, God exists, isn't coexisting with created stuff, maybe. At least God isn't coexisting with a temporally changing order of things. So that is all timelessly true, and timelessly God chooses to create a universe. So that's all true, but it's not true that now God is creating a universe. God did that timelessly. God, of course, is sustaining everything and so on, but the decision to create a universe or not, that was made from the timeless point of view. And so I think the right thing for Craig to say is just that this is, there's all the stuff that's timelessly true, and then there's all the stuff that's now true and that was true and that will be true. And these are just different.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I look forward to figuring that out.
I'm trying. I'm working on it.
Yeah. Dean, man, you gave me so much time here. This has been fantastic. It's been a really, really fun podcast.
Well, I hope you can edit it down so that
yeah, a little bit.
So that's shorter, and
I'll clip out some good stuff too, and make some clips for people who are just interested in modal realism and all that good stuff. But I really appreciate your work. I love, like, we didn't even really get into stuff that you're an expert on, but
stuff that I actually work on.
Yeah. But maybe I can coax you in some other time to come back on and talk about dualism, film mind type stuff, or one of your other interests. But for now, folks, that's going to have to do it. I'll put a link to Dean Zimmerman's website. You can find that in the description. You can find a bunch more of his work there. But for now, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.